We are going to discuss a little bit about the short story, The Tilting, written by Edgar Allan. So, what is special about this short stories? Tiny short story, but a very intriguing one. You can read. So, if you have a chance, please read the story. It's very readable and it's very short. Before we get into the story itself, let's talk a little bit about Edgar Allan Poe. Who was Edgar Allan Poe? He was an American poet, a short story writer, a critic. So he wrote poetry, he wrote short story, but he became famous as a short story writer. So he was one of the most influential figures in literature itself, right? So he was best known for his works of horror, mystery, and terror. So the stories were all in that genre, like horror, mystery, detective fiction. So he actually created the first prototype of the literary detective. So we right now know Sherlock Holmes and all these other literary detectives, whereas Poe in the 19th century was the first one to create a prototype for such a detective, right? So his life, if you look at Poe's own life, it was marked by tragedy. He lost both his parents when he was very, very young. He was taken in by the tobacco merchant from eventually became distant, right? So that was his childhood. So by the early 19th century, he started writing and publishing his poetry and short stories, and he actually became famous. His works explored different aspects of death, madness, fear, obsession, guilt, and different possible aspects of the human psyche itself. So if you look at his short stories and even works of poetry, you would see unreliable narrators, a little bit of psychological suspense, lots of features of Gothic fiction incorporated into his work. Poe passed away at the age of 40 under mysterious circumstances, and the cause of death still remains uncertain. Still don't know why or how he died. When we talk about Edgar Allan Poe and his stories, we need to also talk a little bit about the Gothic. What is the Gothic? So Poe was one of the greatest writers of the Gothic. He was by no means the first writer of the Gothic, but he was one of the greatest writers of the Gothic, and he has inspired numerous writers who came after him. So what is this Gothic writing? Gothic fiction is inspired by the features of medieval Gothic architecture, right? So Gothic architecture is characterized by spires and towers, these pointed arches and stained glass windows and secret passageways. So it creates this appearance of mystery. You can think of castle, right? So the castles that you see in period pieces, period dramas, or even think of Hogwarts and Harry Potter. So those kind of architecture, right? So if you look at European cathedrals and medieval castles, and you will get an idea of what the Gothic architecture really is. So when it comes to literature, these writers employed the features of this Gothic architecture. So the atmosphere, the setting was made by such features which created this appearance of mystery. The first Gothic story was written by Horace Walpole. His Castle of Otranto was the first. It marked the beginning of Gothic fiction. Then Anne Radcliffe's The Mysteries of Udolpho and others employed the features of the Gothic. Edgar Allan Poe became a master of Gothic tales, in which he made use of many features of the Gothic: medieval setting, castles and ancient houses, the theme of horror, all those things he has extensively employed in his stories. He turned these tales into explorations of extreme psychological states pervaded by fear, of terror, and insanity. He didn't stop with the setting alone. So this kind of mystery and the horror and the fear and terror, all these were also both external and internal, right? So it's not just the setting, but it's also the internal field of these characters, internal landscapes of these characters. So in his introduction to Gothic horror, Clive Bloom writes, for Poe, it is perversity that marks horror, just as peculiarity is the mark of art, and both confront common sense, decency, and normal law. So no longer does the external world threaten as much as the internal. Demands of the will become paramount importance. So internal is as much or even more important than the external itself. Now let's look at the stories, the telltale part. What is the plot? So the story was first published in 1843. So when the story opens, you see a narrator who tries to convince the reader that he is not insane. So he literally begins the story. He's narrating the story and he says, he's trying to convince the reader that he's mad. So the story begins. The narrator tells us that he's not mad, but rather have a heightened sensitivity to everything that is going on. Right? He can hear and he can smell. So his senses are heightened rather than. So he's telling that he's not mad, right? He has this heightened senses. That's all. The narrator is deeply disturbed by the vulture-like eye of the old man where he lives. So you will, as he continues with his description, you figure out that he lives with an old man, and this narrator is extremely disturbed by this vulture-like eye of the old man. So what is his final solution for the whole thing? To kill you. Decides to take the old man out. So take the life of the old man, right? So to convince us that he is not mad, but he is extremely careful in planning this whole murder. He walks us through his careful planning of the murder in an attempt to convince us of his sanity. He says, you should have seen how wisely I proceeded, with what caution, with what foresight, with what dissimulation I went to work. So the entire narrative basically involves this narrator trying to tell us that he is not mad, right? So what does he do? For 7 consecutive nights, the narrator goes into the old man's room, every time opening the door a little more than the last day. So, however, the man's eyes are closed as he is sleeping. So the narrator doesn't do anything. He does not do anything because it is only the eye that disturbs him. So he specifies, he clarifies that there is nothing else. There is no other motive involved. The old man is nice to him. He has never insulted him. He even loves the old man. So it is only the eye that makes him decide to kill the old man. Right. So on the 8th night, however, the old man opens his eyes, hearing some noise, and the narrator is finally able to come again. So on the 8th night, as the narrator is opening the door, there is some sort of noise, and the old man opens his eyes, and the light falls on his eye. So we can see the eye, which is the primary objective of this whole scheme, right? So he meticulously describes the fear and the tension in the room as the old man figures out that someone was there in the room. So finally, what happens? So he goes into this extensive detail of how scared the old man was and how careful he was not to let him know who it was or what it was. So he leaves the old man guessing what exactly is happening. He is scared. And finally, at the end, the narrator smothers the man to death. So he's finally killed. If still you think me mad, you will think so no longer. And I describe the wise precautions I took for the concealment of the body. He dismembers the body and buries it under the floorboards. So he still tells us that no, I am not mad. I took so many precautions to bury this body, right? To conceal the body. So what does he do? He dismembers the body and he buries the body under the floorboards, and there is no stain, nothing whatsoever. So as he was finishing up all these things, there was a knock on the door, and when he opened the door, who was it? There were some police officers who came to check because the neighbor has complained of some shriek that happened a while ago. So police officers come to just check. So the narrator is confident that nobody is going to figure out what happened here. He is overconfident, in fact, and he is taking the inspectors in and he's calmly talking to the officers. And at one point, he even takes them to the very room where the body was buried. So he's talking to them, sitting in that very room. However, what happens at this point is that he suddenly starts hearing heartbeat from under the floorboards. This is the old man's heart beating from under the floorboards, right? So he listens to this heartbeat, which is increasing minute by minute. The volume is increasing minute by minute. And he suspects that the detectives, the policemen also can hear this heartbeat. They're not talking, but he assumes that they have already figured out what is going on here because they can also hear the noise. As it becomes unbearable for him, finally he yells out his confession to the officers and tells that he has buried the body under the floorboards. So that is how the story ends.